Good evening, everyone. This evening I would like to bring into the discussion two traditional teachings and explore the way they're commonly held and understood, but in a way that I actually think can sometimes can lead to a misunderstanding. So let me explain what I mean. I want to start first with what many of us have heard many times, the Four Noble Truths. And many of you I know, there's a few names I see here I don't know, so I won't I'll go on too much about it, but I'll just briefly mention, if you don't know, that the Four Noble Truths is generally considered one of the foundational teachings, and it's generally translated as the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, and the truth of an end of suffering, and the path leading to the end of suffering is a typical way it's taught. And the way that I think mostly it's taught is it's looking to have us change direction, and it's often held that just being a human being, most of us, all of us maybe, are led around by our likes and dislikes and by our desires. That's kind of the typical idea. And then the meaning of it is instructing us to make a shift, so that is there a way to break that pattern. And one way it's often talked about is that shifting from having our happiness being or our well-being tied into having or not having any particular experience. You could think of it, one way to think of it is, can we find our well-being in how we relate to what's happening, make a shift in how we relate, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, whether we're getting what we want or not in life. So that's kind of the basic idea of the Four Noble Truths. And it can be viewed as pointing out what all of us foolish human beings are doing, but I actually don't hold it that way. I mean, certainly we do want to use those teachings to help inform exactly what it's pointing to, so we can start to make some shifts and perhaps find a place of equanimity through all the inevitable ups and downs of life. So yes, we wanted to help inform maybe shifting how we relate to ourselves and our experience and our lives. But I also hold it more as just an acknowledgement of this is what it is to be a human being. Not telling us what to do, but more of an empathetic, just acknowledgement of, we're human beings. Of course, people don't want to have unpleasant experiences. They want to have more pleasant, and we tend to get caught in that. And when I reflect on it in this way, rather than seeing it as a prescription for what I should do, and again, I think that's a good perspective we should hold, but I find value also in holding it as a description, a description of how it is for us. And doing that, thinking of it that way, really helps soften and open my own heart towards my own suffering and to the situation and the condition that we all find ourselves in, and open my heart with more empathy towards others too. So I want to come back to that theme of, I'll say more about that in a few moments. But I want to bring in a different teaching now and then come back to the Four Noble Truths. There's a story in the old Pali, the suttas. Those are some of you may know in Sanskrit, sutra. It's related to the English word suture, which means thread. In the Sanskrit, and they're the old texts. And in Pali, it's sutta. And so in the Pali Suttas, which is where the source teachings have been preserved in Theravada Buddhism, there's a story in which of a queen who heard of a teaching of the Buddha that said having those that we care about, who are near and dear to us, is a source of suffering. And the story goes that when the queen hears that teaching, it's kind of baffling to her. She goes, well, I love my daughter. I get great happiness out of my daughter. Can the Buddha really be teaching this? So the story goes on. It's a good teaching story, and it goes on that, she asks and inquires, and the Buddha says, well, yes, in fact, I do teach that. And then she says, well, how can that be true? And he says, well, I mean, you love your daughter, right? The princess. And she says, yes. And well, what would happen if something bad happened? Your daughter got sick or maybe died or, something like that. And she goes, well, I would suffer. And so the Buddha goes on to say, well, this is, and he pointing to impermanence, and that everything does, in fact, end in loss. And one of the classic teachings is the teaching of, if you hang around the Dharma scene for any length of time, there's a lot of emphasis put on the idea of that, we eventually lose everything. Either those around us, maybe they die, they move away. If nothing else, eventually, we're faced with our own mortality. And so that's a classic traditional teaching. And again, I think that, so he goes on to say, so what is born, it's called, what is born, or what do you get from having those who are near to dear and dear to you, and part of it is suffering. That's what he says. And so people often take that teaching in a way that I think is not, is sort of represents what it's really getting to, but we can take it as saying, well, I shouldn't form connections with people because it's going to lead to loss. Well, it's true, it does lead to loss. But you notice in that story, the Buddha is not denying that there is also happiness and joy and love and all the positives that do come. That's not part of the story. They leave that out. He's never quoted saying that's the whole picture. And we don't need the Buddha to tell us that having things we care about, people we care about, can lead to, yes, it can lead to suffering when there's people we care about and maybe they don't act in the ways we like, or there's some kind of loss or whatever. But certainly that there's great happiness can be found there too. And so to me, the way to hold, let me back up. I think the potential downside, if we don't hold this with the right view, is it can lead people to not only shy away from making connections, and that's okay. I mean, that's a choice. Maybe some people do make that decision. However, I think we're out of balance if we find ourselves becoming disconnected. And it's very important because in Dharma practice, practices like the various meditation, whatever practices you may be doing, mostly they're not disconnecting practices. They're actually about connecting. And what I mean, they take many forms, but for example, if you sit down and close your eyes, now I realize we don't all do eyes closed practices, depending on the tradition you've been practicing in. But I think for many of us, say, certainly typical, you close your eyes, and what are you doing? You're bringing your attention inward. And then we engage in some kind of practices that help steady our mind so we're more present, strengthen our mindfulness. And in fact, what is that we're doing? We're actually connecting and deeply connecting. We're not disconnecting. We are enhancing connection with ourselves. So I think we want to be careful and not fall into something that has us, because what can happen is, there can be a sense in this disconnecting style where sometimes you'll hear the word detachment. I think it's a fine word, and it's commonly used. But again, it can, if we're not careful, have that same disconnecting connotation where over there is that person, that thing, that situation, that messy experience, and I'm somehow the untouched, detached witness, and I've made a space between myself and others. But in the spirit of, actually, there can be times where that can be useful, I should say. I don't think we want to throw that out. So please don't get me wrong. Actually, I want to emphasize again, probably all of us will have times where we do have to have some disconnection. I'm not saying we never want to be disconnected, but we don't always want to be disconnected, because also we want to be, I hope, letting the ever-changing flow, moment to moment of our lives, of our experience, inform what's needed. And as we're attuned to the flow of what life's teaching us moment by moment, yes, there's the times when we need to back out. We need to care for ourselves. We need a break or get away or something like that. Sometimes it used to be when you go on these meditation retreats, it didn't matter what was happening. Even if you're having a hard time, the teacher would say, well, were you mindful of it? Did you note it? It didn't matter what was happening. And I actually knew someone who went for a long term, became a nun in Burma for, I don't know, 6 or 7 months. And all this psychological, emotional experiences were coming up, old memories, traumas, and I'm not criticizing anyone, but they just weren't equipped to deal with some Westerner here having a psychological meltdown, and they kept saying, well, be with it, be present with it, be mindful of it. And well, what was needed was the exact opposite. What she really needed was love, empathy, safety, learning how to navigate it in a way, well, yes, we want to find a way to be with things and work with them, but what about the times when you need a break or you're being overwhelmed by something? The answer then isn't be with it. And of course, we have the times where maybe something is overwhelming us. It could be like in this pandemic, this coronavirus situation, where if it's overwhelming, and it can be hard to find a place to get away, right? So that can be hard. So then we do the best we can. But I just bring all that in. By the way, in my friend's case who went to Burma, because of that experience, she completely stopped all practice, Dharma, Buddhism, everything, just turned away from it all because it was such a wounding or hurtful, damaging experience that she had had. So that's kind of an extreme case, but those things can happen. So yes, we do want to be able to know, hopefully have the tools and know when is it time to disconnect. The problem is that many of us don't know the other side of it, which is having the tools to be present and profoundly turn into and connect with. So we have to have that other half also. And so going back to the spirit of that teaching story with the queen and the Buddha talking about what is born from those who are dear, again, he was giving one half of the picture in that teaching story, which is the problem of being overly overly attached without a perspective. And I think really, to me, what life is the invitation is, and the way I'm living is that I have a family. I'm quite aware of all these Dharma teachings. I've been practicing and studying for a long time, and I've had loss in my life. And I'm for some of you, I'm younger, but I'm 67 years old. I'm starting to get older. I'm quite aware of how fast time goes by. 10 more years will be 77, 87, or whatever, if I'm still around. So I'm aware of my own mortality. I'm aware of, I still have a son living at home. He and I are very, very close. I don't know what he's going to choose to do when he gets out of high school, but the track he's on, I think he wants to go to college and he wants to study engineering. So I think, barring it's a surprising change, he's going to go away. I'm suffering now of the empty nest syndrome. He hasn't even gone yet. I'm kind of being a little humorous, but that's actually true. When I reflect like that, it does not make me want to cut off from having relationships. It wants me to hold those near and dear more closely. And actually, it makes me want to open more, not disconnect, makes me want to open more in connection and in love and in empathy. And it makes me want to tend to my own heart and mind and the forces that that tend to create difficulty and suffering, not just for myself, but for others. And it makes me want to really pay attention to the places in me and to cultivate the places in me that not only to hold those, not just physically, but in my heart and mind, all beings closer in a way, but and with more kindness and care, given the situation that we're in. But do it in a way, and I'll put this word in rather than disconnecting, I'll put the word out of that I often use of being disentangled. And so we could have a whole, but I'll just put it out there because it'll have its own connotation for each of you. But I use that word a lot. Some of you have heard me say it a lot because to me, disentangling is the antidote to being disconnected. And again, when I say disconnected, I see a few people who've just joined in. I don't mean the wise and skillful ability and use of being able to step away if the situation will allow. And knowing when it's time to, I guess in a way you would say disconnect if we can. Turn off, get a break. So again, I said this earlier for those who were just joining, that we want to have those tools and those abilities to know when it's time. But for me, at least, I'll just offer to you, by and large, I'm interested in how can I more deeply and profoundly connect, the opposite of disconnecting, but to do it in a way that's disentangled. That is the freedom and liberation that I think we're talking about. So it's a whole big topic then of what do we mean to be disentangled. And this goes back to, I was talking about it several weeks back. I'm not going to restart that now, but we spent some time exploring what do we mean by, you'll hear the phrase liberation through non-clinging. So the balance, if you go back, if you happen to relate to that phrase, that may not be the phrase, the way to articulate the path that rings most true for you, but it's often used. Again, this liberation through non-clinging doesn't mean liberation from being disconnected or to detach. It's to disentangle. And so what does it mean to disentangle? It means to not be all caught up in, right? So to be present with things, but in a way that has a sense of balance and equanimity. And I'll give you an example here that just popped, I just remembered. I'm thinking of a time, I used to work in Silicon Valley. I was an engineer for many years. I lived in Santa Cruz and would commute over there. And I was working, I remember, for a big corporation. I don't remember the details, but someone mistakenly thought I had done something. I don't even remember what it was. And they were pretty mad about it. And they came to me and let me know. There was no physical threat going on, but verbally, they were giving me an earful, let me tell you. And they were just mistaken. I hadn't done what, I didn't know anything about it. But now, that's a kind of situation that anyone could understandably envision the person on the receiving end, as I was, getting defensive and mad and saying, why are you attacking me? And I didn't do that. And, you're a jerk, or I don't know, whatever they might say, right? And back off. And probably people would understand that. I'm certainly not claiming to be immune from ever being reactive about anything in life. But fortunately, my Dharma practice did come to the rescue. And I don't, again, remember the detail, but I just naturally never fell into that. I just knew what was happening in my mind. It's like, here's a person angry. I saw it and I felt it. And I just was able to, rather than react, to respond. And I just remember saying something like, wow, I see you're really angry. Here, come on, let's go find a conference room. Let's go sit down. Tell me what's going on. That sort of helped right away, that I just wasn't defensive. We sat down, and I don't remember any details, but they said whatever. I said, it's just a mistake. I did, it's not me. And they went, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, gee, I'm sorry. And I had the presence say, it's all right. And we moved on. That's an example of being present with something, again, fortunately, I didn't have to disconnect. It was intense. I remember, I have a few memories that it was intense. Um, was able to be with it, to actually stay connected even in that difficulty, but in a way that's disentangled. That's this idea of being disentangled. So even in quite strong experiences, we can have the sense of what is it to be disentangled. So I don't want to go on too much more about that. I want to, I'll leave that to you. As we do most times, we'll have a little bit of time at the end here to open it up if anybody has any your own sharing, or if you have any questions, we can pursue that more. And I'll leave that to you. So let me go back to what I was saying in the beginning about the Four Noble Truths. I hold that teaching in exactly the same way of this teaching on with the queen and with her daughter from the Buddha, that when he said pain and suffering are born from those who are dear to us. There's actually two sides to it, but we have to have both sides. Yes, it is a teaching about being entangled, and if we don't bring wisdom to meet our relationships, it's suffering. Right? But again, the potential there is to realize, wow, it's true. There is going to be loss and pain and suffering. And then notice how, maybe it's an experiment. How does that affect my relationships with others? As I shared a few minutes ago, for me, I draw nearer to them. I hold them as more precious. Given that we're all, sometimes, one thing I've always wanted to do, I've never done it, but I think it's too risky, but I wanted to start a talk someday. Maybe I'll do it someday. And I wanted to say, good evening, welcome my fellow sufferers. And then, of course, I'd have to clean that up for all the reaction. But of course, we all are fellow sufferers, but I hope that's only part of the picture. I hope we're also fellow experiencers of happiness and well-being. So we're fellow sufferers of the whole range of what it is to be a human being. Well, I hold the Four Noble Truths in a similar way. Yes, I said you could hold it as prescriptive or descriptive. When I hold it, and I think you need both. I really do. You need the prescription and sometimes it's actually talked of as a prescription. You'll hear that in the traditional teachings. It prescribes, there's sort of what's the disease, if you will. They don't call it that, but what's the problem? Problem is we fall into suffering. Many of you know this, heard it many times, due to clinging. Second is part of the prescription. What's causing that suffering? It's craving, which causes the clinging of the first noble truth. Third is ending it, and the fourth is the medicine of the way to end it, right? So we want it as a prescription, but notice what happens for yourself, and you can go either now or as you take this in through the rest of your day or your evening or tomorrow. What happens if you hold it just as a description? And you don't, maybe just for the moment, you don't do anything else. Just pause and just say, this is what it is to be a human being. And we are all fellow sufferers, actually. Again, hopefully it's not the whole picture, but it's true. What it does to my heart is similar to, as I was reflecting on Born from Those Who Were Dear. I tend to be kinder to myself and others and hold everyone as more precious. So that's just the result it has for me. So I think I'll pause there.